your dreams.
Welcome back to another video, and today I'm just going to be doing a review of Zenless Zone Zero, coming from a perspective of somebody that has never played any of the previous closed beta tests. I also hardly looked at any of the gameplay, so I basically went into this game blind with some pretty low expectations. Also, forgive me if this video does seem a little sloppy. I am not using a script, so everything here is basically going to be just coming straight out of my heart, out of my soul, maybe a little bit out of my ass. I also want to point out that I am not affiliated with Hoyoverse in any shape or form. If you are not new to the channel, you will definitely understand why Hoyoverse would not want to be affiliated with me. Hoyoverse is not paying me in money or any in-game currency to make this review, if you guys are wondering. Also, if you like this video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe. Anyways, I've been playing Zenless Zone Zero for at least about a week now, so I've been playing it for more than 6 hours, more than 8 hours, probably more than 24 hours, and I think Zenless Zone Zero might actually be my new favorite Hoyoverse game. Combat is very fun, flashy, and very responsive. When it comes to presentation, Hoyoverse definitely always delivers, and it's definitely there in the combat itself. The cutscenes are also very phenomenal as well. The characters are very expressive. The character designs are extraordinary, and it gets a plus from me since it filters out normies and Twitter toddlers thanks to the lollies in the game. If you don't know, the leading artist for Zenless Zone Zero is Kuma. He's very famous for his lolly art. He is definitely a Giga Chad because on his Twitter he basically posts a lot of pictures of his motorbike. So the fact that Hoyoverse hired this man to be the leading artist for Zenless Zone Zero, they definitely want to cater to a particular audience, most likely the Blue Archive audience. They definitely don't want any of the Twitter toddlers or normies audience for this game, and I think it's a good thing because those people on Twitter, they're very annoying. I think it's very good that this game filters them out. The music in Zenless Zone Zero is also very amazing as well. I don't know if I want to showcase any music because of copyright shit, but I do think their music is actually pretty phenomenal. It gets me Jet Set Radio vibes mixed with Persona, which does make sense since Zenless Zone Zero does have that urban fantasy feel to it. So now let's talk about the gameplay of Zenless Zone Zero. What is the gameplay like in this game? Now, I'm sure most of you have heard about this TV labyrinth mode that Zenless Zone Zero has. A lot of people seem to hate this game mode. Basically, what you're seeing is a labyrinth mode or a dungeon crawling mode. This dungeon crawling TV mode is a big part of the game. You basically get items, power-ups, occasionally debuffs every now and then. Combat will happen in certain tiles or in certain TVs. When I first played Zenless Zone Zero, I actually didn't really like this dungeon crawling mode. It just felt out of place because, like many other people, we downloaded the game for the combat, but most of the time you're going to be spending time here with combat sprinkled in every now and then, and also story as well. This is also a pretty big part of the story, but as the game progressed, I actually started to see myself enjoying this game mode a little bit, because in the beginning of the game you're basically going from point A to point B, but as you progress you do encounter some puzzles. Whether it's moving an object, avoiding hazard, memorizing a few things. I do think the puzzles do make this game mode a little bit more fun, but I can understand why people don't like this mode because it just feels out of place for a combat-oriented game. In Honkai Impact 3rd and Punishing Gray Raven, you select a stage, you get a bit of story, and then you go straight into the combat. But in Zenless Zone Zero, you select a stage, you get this TV dungeon crawling mode, and then you get a bit of combat sprinkled every now and then. So I do think this TV labyrinth mode kind of just makes the game feel out of pace. I think they should have just used it exclusively for the Hollow Zero game mode, in which I will explain a little bit more later in the video, because I do think the TV Labyrinth is actually like way better there. And just have the story mode just basically be, you know, select a stage, get a bit of story, and then you go straight into the combat. Speaking of the story mode, I might as well briefly explain the different kind of campaigns that you will experience in the world of Zenless Zone Zero. You have the story mode, which is basically what it is. It's basically the story. You basically get a bit of the TV Labyrinth and combat sprinkled every now and then in this game mode. The other two game modes, the exploration and combat, those are basically like your side quest modes. The combat commissions are basically what they are. They're basically just straight up combat. No TV Labyrinth mode is seen here. And in the exploration commissions, this is basically more of the TV Labyrinth mode and less combat here. Side quests are pretty important in order to level up your inner knot level, which is basically your equivalent to adventure rank or trailblaze level. I have no idea why it's called inner knot. I've seen some jokes about the word knot, especially since this game does have furries in it. I guess it's supposed to be like a play on internet. Anyways, let me talk about the combat in this game, since that's basically the important part of Zenless Zone Zero. The combat basically consists of your basic attacks, skills, switch-ins, ultimates, chain attacks, and parries. In order to use your skill, you do have to basic attack your opponents in order to build up energy to use your skill. However, the game also doesn't really tell you that you can actually use your skill even if you don't have any energy. You basically just use a weaker version of it though. Each enemy has like a yellow bar beneath their HP bar, and if that yellow bar fills up, they basically get into a break state, which basically means you could basically pummel that enemy. You do have elements in this game like fire, ice, electric, physical, ether, and enemies are obviously going to have weaknesses to specific elements, so having multiple elements will be very handy. You're only using 3 characters in one team, which a lot of combat gacha games typically have. On the top left, you'll notice like a point system. If you get 3,000 points, you'll be able to use your ultimate. However, all 3 of your characters basically share the same ultimate energy bar, or I guess in this case the points, so you do have to choose which ultimate you want to choose out of your 3 characters carefully. Character roles are also very easy to understand. You got attacker, support, stunner, I think there's a anomaly class, I think, and there's also a support class. So when it comes to character roles, it's very simple to figure out who's a main DPS, who's not a main DPS, etc, etc. When it comes to parrying, parrying is actually very easy in this game. The game does give you a huge time window to parry enemies, so you don't have to really focus too hard in order to parry enemies in this game. Now, when it comes to chain attacks, I'm not exactly sure how I can very well explain this, because it's very easy for me to understand it because I've played Xenoblade before. Basically, in combat, you'll have a chance to perform this thing called a chain attack. The game will basically freeze for a few seconds and you'll choose which character you want to pick in order for them to deal the next damage. And after that character deals the damage, you'll select another character to deal another damage. And by the end of the chain attack, you'll basically get a huge damage. Chain attacks are pretty important since this is basically a huge part of the damage that you can do. Anyways, just like most Hoyoverse games, this game is actually pretty easy, so anybody can easily pick up and play this game just fine. I do think the combat is kind of okay-ish. I do think Punishing Gray Raven and Honkai Impact 3rd does have better combat, but you also got to keep in mind that in the beginning of those 2 games that I mentioned, the combat was also bare bones. Especially in Honkai Impact 3rd, the very beginning game was very bad. The free-to-play characters were very basic. Free-to-play Bronya was very bad. PGR was same thing in the very beginning of the game. Combat was very basic. The combat in these 2 games didn't really get good until later on. So I think Zenless Zone Zero is basically going to be the same thing. Beginning of the game, it's mediocre, but as more characters get released, I do think the combat will be better in Zenless Zone Zero. I do think Zenless Zone Zero has a better beginning than PGR and Honkai Impact 3rd, but that's just the nature of most gacha games. The beginning of the game is basically bare bones, but as more characters get released, you'll have more complexity. The story mode for Zenless Zone Zero has 2 modes. You got a casual mode and a challenger mode. Casual mode is exactly how it sounds. It's just for casual players. Challenging mode is not really that challenging. It basically just bloats the enemy's HP. I did play challenging for most of the story mode, and I eventually switched to casual because it's basically just challenging mode is basically just more HP on the enemies. They're not more aggressive. I don't think they deal more damage. I'm not exactly 100% sure if they deal more damage, but I definitely noticed that the enemies in challenging mode have way more HP than the ones in the casual mode. Challenge mode doesn't really reward you with anything extra, so I don't really think it's really worth doing unless you just want to whack on a huge HP sponge. I want to talk about the hub world of ZZZ for a little bit. You do have a hub world that you can explore. The only reason this hub world exists is basically just to find side quests to do. It's not an open world aspect, but I do appreciate the amount of detail that they've put into the hub world. The hub world is very small, but just the amount of details that they've put is very astounding, especially in the video store. You can see all types of covers and stuff, and the amount of details they put into the covers. First City is also very pretty to look at. Aside from the side quests that you can find, there's also a coffee shop and a noodle shop that gives you buffs, an arcade full of mini games that you can play. You eventually find the daily dungeons that you can do to level up your characters, level up their skills, etc, etc. My only complaint about the hub world is that you don't move fast enough. You move pretty slowly even if you're sprinting. I know the hub world is pretty small, but at least increase the running speed on this. I also don't like that you can't play as your playable characters in the hub world. You can only play your playable characters in the combat sections. Not only do you have a hub world, but you also have like a home screen as well. This is basically where you can view your achievements, view your mail, view your DMs. You can at least change the character on your screen to a playable character once you've unlocked their affinity level. Now, when it comes to the story of Zenless Zone Zero, I have no idea what's going on because the game has a skip button and I've used it. So the story gets a 10 out of 10 for me purely because you can just skip the story. You do get cutscenes that are unskippable, and the cutscenes do look very good. At the beginning of the video, I did say they were full of expression and soul. When it comes to stories and gacha games, I don't really care, because most of the time they're kind of minimum. However, stories are typically just yap fests most of the time. Characters never really shut the fuck up. They tend to really over-explain things in these games, and I think Hoyoverse just does that just to make the game feel longer. You know that classic anime trope in which the anime character basically explains their abilities so the reader or the watcher will understand it? That's basically how Hoyoverse stories are like, but 10 times worse, and they use a lot of made-up words. Wouldn't be surprised if Zenless Zone Zero followed the same trope. Now, even though I did skip most of the story, I did notice a few details. Like, for example, they do have like a comic kind of storytelling that they've got going on, which is pretty unique. In fact, I might actually go back and reread, or I guess rewatch the story. I don't know what's going on in the story, but from what I can pick up, the two main characters, Belle and Weiss, they are basically siblings that are average Joes that are trying to make a living. They got two jobs. One of them is running a video store. Their second job, which is basically their real hustle, is that they explore this thing called the Hollow illegally. The Hollow is basically like this fucked up landscape that's outside of the city, basically just dangerous parts of the world. The story itself just seems pretty lighthearted. Nothing really serious really goes on here. All the characters seem to have a quirky personality, which is pretty nice. Overall, I think if you're looking for something lighthearted, I think this game's story will be perfect for you. I just don't understand how this game gets a skip button on day one, but their other two games still does not have a skip button. From a week of playing Zenless Zone Zero, I've discovered at least 2 endgame modes for Zenless Zone Zero. One of them, which is my favorite, is called the Hollow Zero. This is basically similar to the simulated universe in Honkai Star Rail. You basically have the TV dungeon crawling, and you basically get buffs and goodies along the way in this game mode. How it starts basically is that you select a squad leader, and then the other 2 members of your party will basically be separated from you. And as you crawl along this dungeon, you'll be able to recruit your allies that you've selected. So as for the squad leader, it might be wise to choose your your main DPS, because you will be playing that character for a while. You will encounter buffs, debuffs, random events every now and then. I think the TV Labyrinth should have just been exclusively for this game mode instead of having it in the main story campaign. You can also grind out the Hollow Zero for permanent buffs, just like in Simulated Universe. So if you are struggling in a particular stage, you can just go to the stage below it, grind it out, get some permanent buffs, and you'll be good to go. I do believe this resets weekly, kind of like in Simulated Universe. The next game mode they have is called, I think it's called Shiryu Defense. This is basically the game's equivalent to Abyss. You're basically in a room stuck with enemies, and you basically got to defeat those enemies in a certain time limit. Eventually, you will need 2 teams. This game mode will obviously challenge your knowledge of the game, knowledge of the character's kits, knowledge of the game's mechanics, knowledge of team composition. This is where the game will stop holding your hand. Most combat mobile gacha games typically have you make multiple teams of different elements. I think Zenless Zone Zero is most likely going to be going for that route, so you're definitely going to be needing a fire team, ice team, electric team, physical team, and an ether team. But since the game literally just came out a week ago, we obviously can't fill in every team as of right now. The most busted team at the moment is obviously Ice, since Ellen Jo is the rate up character and she is an Ice character. Both of these game modes will obviously reward you with limited currency to pull on banners. They both also have shops that you can buy goodies from. I don't remember on the top of my head like what you can buy in these shops. I think both of them definitely contain the currency for the Bangboos banners. Speaking of banners, I might as well explain how the banner system works in Zenless Zone Zero. You obviously have the standard banner, which is full of standard characters. You have the limited banner, which has the limited character. You also have the limited weapon banner, which has the weapons. And you have the Bangboos banner. Bangboos are basically your equivalent to the elves in Honkai Impact 3rd, or I guess the Astral OP as they now call it, and the Cubs in Punishing Gray Raven. Basically pets that follow you around, deal damage, offer passives. That's basically what they do. To get a guaranteed S rank in the limited banner, you need to at least pull 90 times. And there's also a 50-50 system. Hooray. I don't know if the weapon banner shares a 50-50 system. I only know the character banner has a 50-50 system because it's a Hoyoverse game. Let's be real. When it comes to the free-to-play friendliness of the game, it's kind of hard to really determine since the game only came out a week ago. Since this is Hoyoverse we are talking about, they are pretty stingy. I do think Star Rail is the most generous out of the Hoyoverse games, but even then in Star Rail they release new characters at a faster rate, so they kind of have to give out a few more pulls. We don't really know how often newer characters are going to show up in Zenless Zone Zero. As of right now, Ellen Jo is basically on rate up. I don't know if another 5-star is going to come this patch. If we compare ZZZ's gachas to other hack and slash games, Punishing Gray Raven is way more free-to-play friendly. They have a few S-rank selectors. They give out freebies pretty often. You can basically get any character you want as a free-to-play in Punishing Gray Raven. In Honkai Impact 3rd, I mean, they do have a Stigmata banner, which is basically the equivalent of like a relic banner or an artifact banner. Their reruns also cost a little bit more premium currency as well. Ether Gazer, a game that I forgot to mention earlier, also gives out a pretty decent amount of freebies. The only free-to-play friendly Zenless Zone Zero has is basically in the story mode. You don't actually have to use your own characters. You can use the trial characters, so you don't even have to level up your own characters to participate in the story mode, which is nice for those people that only want to participate in the story. But when it comes to freebies, I do think they're kind of slacking a little bit. I forgot to mention that I'm free to play as of right now in Zenless Zone Zero. I don't know if I'll spend anything yet. I'm kind of waiting to see if they'll ever like be generous first. But as of right now, ZZZ is just a little stingy at the moment. Now, how does this game compare to Wuthering Waves? I've noticed a lot of people really like to compare both of these games, probably because both of these companies are rivals in a way. Not to mention both of these games kind of came out almost nearly like a month apart. I don't think it's a fair comparison to compare both of these games because Wuthering Waves is an open world game with Pokemon aspects, while Zenless Zone Zero is a hack and slash with some dungeon crawling aspects. I do think Wuthering Waves has slightly better combat. My only problem with the combat is sometimes the camera kind of just spazzes out. Like if I'm fighting a boss, the camera will like point up at the sky while I'm getting bodied by the boss because I can't see the boss because the fucking camera fucks me over. I do think some characters in Wuthering Waves are pretty jank. The melee characters play pretty well, but ranged characters, they're really hard to parry with. Gun characters are kind of cope, but I do think Wuthering Waves has better combat, more memorable boss fights. ZZZ doesn't really have that many memorable bosses. It doesn't really help that most enemies in this game kind of look the same. I think the most memorable boss in ZZZ is probably one of those those huge construction bots. When it comes to character designs, I think ZZZ wins hands down. A lot of the characters in Wuthering Waves, they kind of mostly look the same. The only characters I liked in Wuthering Waves design wise was Cheng-Li, Baiji, Encore, and Verena. When it comes to the music, I think ZZZ wins in that aspect. There are some good soundtracks in Wuthering Waves, but I don't really think there's that many. When it comes to the amount of freebies, I think Wuthering Waves wins that one. Wuthering Waves has been very generous so far. Granted, most of that generosity comes from the fact that the launch was a huge fuck up, but you know, it was a good generosity regardless. Kuro Games has always been pretty generous so far. They've always had that good track record of being generous. For Hoyoverse, they kind of play good cop, bad cop with their games. They're bad cop in Genshin Impact, but good cop in Star Rail. Zenless Zone Zero, not really sure yet. I guess maybe neutral cop for Zenless Zone Zero. But when it comes to freebies, Wuthering Waves wins. I do think Wuthering Waves is harder than Zenless Zone Zero. Wuthering Waves does provide a challenge for players that do want a challenge, but I do think Wuthering Waves has a good balance between casual and hardcore players. ZZZ also does have a pretty good balance between casual and hardcore because like in the story, you don't need to level up your characters whatsoever. You can just use trial characters. Not to mention they have a mode called casual mode. Hoyoverse has always been catering to casual players, but they can appeal to hardcore players if they want to. I think Star Rail is a pretty good example of them catering to the hardcore players. In ZZZ, if you do want the hardcore stuff, you do have to eventually reach the end game. But in Wuthering Waves, you can kind of get to the hardcore stuff almost like immediately from the hologram game mode. In the open world, you can also encounter high level enemies up to like 120. Overall, I do like Wuthering Waves better, but I don't really think it's like a fair comparison to compare these two games, as Wuthering Waves will appeal more to an open world audience, while ZZZ will appeal to those that really like flashy animations, combat, with some dungeon crawling mixed in. Not to mention the localization in ZZZ is actually very good, unlike Wuthering Waves' localization. Their localization is really all over the place, especially when it comes to the audio engineering in Wuthering Waves. You got some characters that speak very softly while other characters speak very loud. Wuthering Waves also has some mistranslations that almost fucked over the Japanese market, but at the end of the day, Wuthering Waves still has managed to pull through, which is pretty good. I do think that Wuthering Waves should have been in the oven a little bit longer, but they still managed to pull through, which is pretty good. In conclusion, it's really just going to depend on your preferences, whether you like Zenless Zone Zero more or Wuthering Waves more. In general, I think Zenless Zone Zero is a good game. If you're thinking about trying out the game, go ahead. It should only take you 30 minutes to an hour to really determine whether you will stick with the game or not. If you're still not really sure, you can always just come back to the game at a later day. I give Zenless Zone Zero an 8 out of 10. I really like the flashiness in the combat, how easy it is. Character designs are really great. Music is pure eargasm. Hollow Zero is also one of my favorite game modes in Zenless Zone Zero. I really like that game mode. I really like Labyrinth type game modes. I really wish Genshin's Imaginary Theater was very similar to this. I think it should have been something like Hollow Zero. Anyways, I really enjoyed the game. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Have you tried out Zenless Zone Zero? What do you think of Zenless Zone Zero? And I'll see you guys later.
Bye bye now. Come again soon.